I need time to think, I stammered. Sebastian nodded, as if he expected it. Of course. You can stay here, in the guest room, for as long as you need. I have security watching your old apartment, and Micah's known associates. No one will bother you. You're safe either way. He stood then, the conversation over. He rinsed his mug in the sink and left the kitchen, leaving me alone at the island. The silence of the massive penthouse pressing in on me. Later, back in the quiet luxury of the guest room, I stood before the vast window. The city sprawled below, indifferent. For 18 months, I had walked on eggshells, my entire existence a calculated effort to avoid provoking the monster I lived with. Safety was a foreign concept, a word that had no meaning. Sebastian had eliminated the monster, but in his place stood another, one who offered me a choice. I looked down at my wrist. The ugly purple fingerprints were already starting to fade. I wondered, with a tremor that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a terrifying, unfamiliar hope, what freedom actually feels like. For 3 days, I lived in the surreal calm of Sebastian's penthouse. I existed in a state of suspended animation, floating in a world of expensive sheets and silent, watchful security guards. I didn't turn on the news. I didn't check my phone. I simply was. On the 3rd day, I decided I couldn't hide in the sky forever. I needed normalcy, the familiar rhythm of work, something to convince myself that my old life hadn't been completely erased. I told Sebastian I was going back to Bellissimo for my evening shift. He didn't argue, simply nodded and said, "A car will be waiting for you." The news broke while I was polishing wine glasses just before the dinner rush. Maria had the television in the staff room on, tuned to a local news channel. Micah's smiling face, a photo from 2 years ago, before his eyes had turned permanently mean, flashed onto the screen. His brother had officially reported him missing. His car had been found abandoned at the industrial docks, the driver's side door left open. His phone was on the passenger seat. The reporter added a chilling detail. The last call made from the phone was to my number at 10:32 p.m. on Friday night, just minutes before he had stormed into the restaurant. Every head in the room turned to me. I felt the blood drain from my face, the heavy wine glass suddenly slick in my hand. It had begun. They arrived an hour later, 2 of them. They didn't look like the cops on television. They looked tired and rumpled, their cheap suits doing little to hide the paunch of middle age. They introduced themselves as Detectives Charles and John. Charles was the talker, with a practiced, easy smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. John was his shadow, a big, silent man who seemed to take up all the air in the room. "They found me by the hostess stand. Theodora Andrew?" Charles asked, his voice oozing a false, friendly charm. "Yes?" "We'd like to ask you a few questions about Micah Crawford." He looked me up and down, a slow, dismissive appraisal that made my skin crawl. "Girls like you always seem to attract the wrong kind of attention, don't they?" The question was a slap, wrapped in a lazy smile. It had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with prejudice. The implication was clear. I was the kind of girl who got herself into trouble, the kind of girl who ended up with men like Micah, the kind of girl who wasn't a real victim. "We can talk here, or you can come down to the station." "Your choice," Charles said, making it sound like anything but. "It would look better if you came voluntarily." The ride to the station was silent. It didn't feel voluntary. They placed me in a small, windowless room with a metal table and 3 chairs. It was cold. Charles and John sat across from me, the picture of bored bureaucracy. The questions started simply. When did I last see Micah? Friday night at my workplace. What was our relationship status? He was my ex-boyfriend. Who else was there? Staff? Other customers? Then the tone shifted. The friendly facade dropped away. John leaned forward, his bulk crowding the small table. "We have witnesses saying you were arguing with the victim outside Bellissimo Friday night." It was a lie, a deliberate, calculated twist of the truth. "No," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "He was attacking me. I wasn't arguing." Charles waved a dismissive hand. "Details, details. We also have witnesses placing you with known criminals. A man named Sebastian Valentino. Ring any bell?" My heart hammered against my ribs. I chose my words carefully, clinging to the truth where I could. Sebastian is a regular customer at the restaurant. Micah was drunk and violent. Sebastian intervened. "Intervened," Charles repeated, savoring the word. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "See, here's what I think happened. I think you got tired of your boyfriend knocking you around. Can't say I blame you. So you asked your new friend Sebastian to make the problem go away." He smiled, a flash of predatory satisfaction in his eyes. "That's conspiracy to commit murder, sweetheart. That's 25 to life." It was a bluff, a shot in the dark. But sitting in that cold, sterile room with the weight of their accusations pressing down on me, I didn't know that. The air left my lungs. The walls of the small room seemed to be closing in, the threat of a cage more real than anything I had ever known. I opened my mouth to speak, to deny it, but no words came out. And then the door opened. A man in a perfectly tailored gray suit stepped inside. He was impeccably dressed, his presence radiating a calm, sharp intelligence that instantly changed the dynamics of the room. "Theodora, I'm Marcus Chen. I'm your lawyer." He turned to the two detectives, his expression one of mild disappointment. This interview is over. My client is leaving." Charles sputtered, his composure cracking. "Hey, you can't just—" "Any further questions will go through me," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the protest like steel. "And gentlemen, if you ever conduct an illegal interrogation of my client without counsel present again, I'll have your badges." He gestured to the door. I stood on shaky legs and walked out of the room, not daring to look back. I had no idea how he knew I was there, how he had found me. Marcus drove me back to Sebastian's penthouse in a sleek black car that whispered through the city streets. "They're not interested in finding Micah," he explained, his eyes on the road. "They're interested in using his disappearance to hurt Sebastian. You're the leverage they think they've found." When we arrived, Sebastian was waiting for us in the living room, standing before the vast window overlooking the city. He turned as I walked in, and the look on his face made me stop in my tracks. It was a cold, controlled fury, more terrifying than any shouting rage could ever be. But it wasn't directed at me. "They went after you to get to me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "That's a mistake they'll regret." He turned away, pulling out his phone. He made a series of calls, his words clipped and imprecise, a rapid-fire string of commands in both English and Italian. He was activating a network, mobilizing forces I couldn't comprehend. Within 2 hours, as I sat numbly on his couch, a file appeared on the tablet he was holding. He showed it to me. It was everything on Charles and John, their gambling debts, their connections to the Moretti crime family, Sebastian's rivals, and detailed evidence of them tampering with cases for years. It was in that moment that I understood. Sebastian's power wasn't just money, it was information, it was connections that reached into the darkest corners of the city, people and places that mattered. He wasn't just a rich man, he was a king in a hidden kingdom, and he was using the entire weight of his empire to protect me. After he was done, after the calls were made and the orders were given, he finally came and sat across from me. The fury was gone, replaced by an intensity that was focused entirely on me. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken questions. "Why me?" I finally whispered, the question that had been haunting me for days. "You don't even know me." Sebastian leaned forward, his dark eyes holding mine. "I know enough," he said, his voice low and certain. "I know you worked double shifts and still smiled at customers. I know you hid bruises and never let it affect your work. I know you were saving money in secret to escape. I know you're stronger than you think you are." He paused, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "And I know what it looks like when someone is being slowly killed by a person who claims to love them," he said. "I won't watch that happen again." "You can't go back to your apartment." Sebastian's words were not a suggestion, they were a statement of fact, delivered with the same cold finality as when he'd told me Micah was gone. "Charles and John know who you are. Now the Moretti family knows you exist. Your apartment isn't a home anymore, it's a target." And so I moved in. My few belongings, a couple of boxes of clothes, textbooks, and a framed photo of my parents, looked pitiful and out of place when a silent guard carried them into the sprawling guest room. This was my life now, temporarily. I was living in a fortress that made Fort Knox look casual. Unseen cameras watched every angle, silent guards patrolled the halls, and the floor-to-ceiling windows were made of bulletproof glass. I was safer than I had ever been in my life, and I had never felt more like a prisoner. Over the next week, the gilded cage became my classroom. Sebastian, honoring my unspoken request to be shielded from the darkest parts of his world, began to show me the other side of his empire. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a complex and brilliant businessman who operated in the gray areas between worlds. He walked me through the ledgers of his import-export business, a genuinely profitable enterprise that brought fine wines and olive oils into the country. He showed me the real estate portfolio for development neighborhoods, projects that would employ hundreds of people. His legitimate businesses were vast, employing over 200 people across his restaurants alone. He was building an empire, and I was beginning to understand that violence was only one of his tools. He introduced me to his inner circle, the key pieces of the machine that kept his world turning. I already knew Marcus Chen, the sharp, impeccably dressed lawyer who had kept Sebastian out of prison for a decade. Then I met Anthony Russo, his head of security. He was a mountain of a man, former special forces, with quiet, watchful eyes and a loyalty to Sebastian that was absolute and unwavering. He was the one who had organized the guards and secured the penthouse, the silent sword to Marcus's legal shield. And then there was Isabella Moreno, the business manager who ran all of Sebastian's legitimate operations. She was sharp, elegant, and had eyes that saw far too much. The moment she met me, she took one look at my face and the fading bruises on my wrist, and she knew. There was a flicker of painful recognition in her expression. Later, when we were alone for a moment, she spoke to me in a low voice. "Sebastian doesn't save everyone," she said, her words carefully chosen. "But when he decides someone's worth saving, he doesn't do it halfway." She knew, I realized, because it had happened to someone she loved too, her sister. Living in such close quarters, the lines between protector and protected began to blur. The formal distance Sebastian had maintained slowly eroded, replaced by a complicated rapport. There were late-night conversations in his study. the city lights twinkling below as he spoke of his ambitions and I spoke of my dream of becoming a nurse. One evening, after I admitted how helpless I felt, he took me to a private gym in the building and began teaching me the basics of self-defense: how to break a hold, where to strike, how to use an attacker's weight against them. He was a patient teacher, his touch firm but impersonal, yet the proximity was electric. Needing to do something normal, something that felt like me, I started cooking dinner. The simple act of creating a meal in his sterile, professional-grade kitchen felt like an act of defiance. The attraction between us was a low hum in the air, undeniable but fraught with complications. I was vulnerable, he was powerful, and we both knew the dynamic was inherently problematic. He never crossed the line, but the tension was a constant, simmering presence. The first counterattack from the outside world came not with a bang, but with a warrant. Charles and John, frustrated by their inability to touch Sebastian and humiliated by their encounter with Marcus, decided to come for me. They couldn't frame a king, so they decided to frame the waitress he was protecting. They planted evidence in my old apartment, a crude and vicious setup. A cheap burner phone with fabricated text to a hitman, malware on my laptop that created a browser history of searches like how to make someone disappear, a forged entry in an old journal, the handwriting a passable imitation of my own, talking about how much I wanted Micah dead. They took their flimsy, fabricated evidence to a friendly judge and got a search warrant based on an anonymous tip. But they underestimated Sebastian's reach. His people, still monitoring my apartment, alerted him the moment the warrant was signed. He was on the phone instantly, his voice a low growl of command. "Anthony, get to her apartment. Police are on their way. Photograph everything. Now." Anthony moved with military precision, breaking into my apartment, an illegal but necessary act, minutes before the police arrived. He documented everything: the placement of the phone, the too perfect journal entry left open on the table. The evidence screamed setup. It was too convenient, too perfect. Sebastian's next call was to Marcus. His voice was cold steel. "They're trying to frame her. Stop it." The legal battle was a swift and brutal checkmate. Marcus filed an emergency motion to quash the warrant, arguing it was obtained under false pretenses with fabricated evidence. In court, he presented Anthony's time-stamped photos. The laptop searches had supposedly occurred at a time when he could prove, via security footage from Bellissimo, that I was at work. The burner phone was clean of my fingerprints. A forensic analysis, rushed through by a contact of Marcus's, showed the ink on the journal entry was less than a day old. The judge, furious at being played, dismissed the evidence with prejudice and issued a blistering warning to the district attorney's office about their detectives. Charles and John were publicly and professionally humiliated. Their retaliation was personal and ugly. It happened 2 nights later. I had insisted on working my shift, clinging to that last piece of my old life. Sebastian's security was usually seamless, but that night there was a rare gap, a 2-minute window as one guard finished his shift and another was delayed in traffic. That's all Charles needed. He cornered me in the alley behind Bellissimo as I was leaving. John stood at the entrance, a bulky silhouette, making sure no one saw. Charles didn't touch me. He didn't have to. He took a step closer, his smile a venomous sneer. "You think you're protected?" he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "You think Sebastian can watch you every second? Girls like you end up dead in alleys. No one cares. No one investigates." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He was promising me an anonymous, forgotten death. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me shaking in the darkness. That was my breaking point. I reported the threat to Sebastian the moment I got back to the penthouse. As I spoke, his face became a mask of stone, and he went quiet, the kind of profound, unnerving quiet that precedes an earthquake. When I finished, he stared out at the city for a long moment. They threatened you directly, he said, his voice barely a whisper. That changes things. What are you going to do? I asked, my voice trembling. He turned to look at me, and the cold fury in his eyes made my breath catch. What I should have done the moment they walked into your life. He pulled out his phone and made a call. He spoke in rapid-fire Italian, the instructions short and lethal. When he hung up, he looked at me, and his expression was grim. Charles and John have 72 hours to leave the city, if they're still here after that, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. They'll disappear, like Micah did. A cold dread washed over me. I had moved from being protected by violence to being the cause of it. I didn't ask for this, I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Sebastian's gaze held mine, hard and unwavering. I know, he said, but you're in it now, regardless. Sebastian's ultimatum to Charles and John was a stone dropped into a dark pond, and the ripples reached farther than I could have imagined. By threatening the Moretti family's assets within the police department, he had forced their hand. Dante Moretti, the aging patriarch of the rival organization, was not a man who appreciated being cornered. He saw Sebastian's distraction, his focus on me, and identified it not as a line that shouldn't be crossed, but as a weakness to be exploited. The plan was brutally simple. Abduct the waitress, and Sebastian would trade his territory on the docks for her safe return. He would be humbled, his power checked, and the Morettis would gain the foothold they'd coveted for years. The catalyst was a box of old photographs. It was the last thing of value left in my apartment, a collection of faded images of my parents that I couldn't bear to lose. Against Sebastian's explicit advice, I insisted on going to retrieve it. It will only take a minute, I argued, desperate for one last connection to the life that had been stolen from me. Anthony can come with me. We'll be in, out. Sebastian had finally agreed, his jaw tight with a disapproval he didn't voice. The old apartment building looked shabby and unfamiliar. Anthony stood watch, a silent, imposing guardian, as I loaded the small, dusty box into the trunk of his car. It was then that they made their move. Two men emerging from the alleyway beside the building. They were not street thugs. They moved with a quiet, professional efficiency that made the hair on my arms stand up. They flanked me, cutting off any escape. One of them, a man with a thin scar above his lip, produced a gun from beneath his jacket. The movement was fluid, economical. He didn't point it at me, just held it low, a clear and undeniable threat. Come quietly, he said, his voice calm. No one gets hurt. It happened faster than I could process. Before I could even draw a breath to scream, Anthony moved with a lethal precision that was terrifying to behold. He closed the distance in a single step, his hand striking the gunman's wrist in a sharp, brutal motion. The gun clattered to the pavement. In the same fluid movement, Anthony spun, driving his elbow into the man's throat. The man collapsed, gagging. The second man, reacting a split second too late, drew his own weapon. He fired. The shot was a deafening crack in the quiet street, the bullet missing me by inches and punching a hole in the car door with a violent thud. Before he could fire again, Anthony was on him, disarming him and driving him to the ground with a force that knocked the wind from his lungs. In under 30 seconds, both Moretti soldiers were unconscious on the pavement. I stood frozen, the box of photos scattered at my feet, the smell of cordite sharp in the air. My entire body trembled with the chilling realization of how close I had come to being abducted, to disappearing into the back of a car just as Micah had. One of the men began to stir, groaning. Anthony dragged him to his knees and put a heavy hand on his chest. Tell Dante Moretti that was his one mistake, Anthony said, his voice a low, cold growl. He doesn't get another. The soldier, dazed and bleeding from his lip, coughed. Moretti says the girl for the docks territory. That's the deal. Anthony's response was immediate and absolute. There is no deal, he said, his voice like chipping ice. Tell your boss to prepare for war. When we returned to the penthouse, Sebastian was beyond rage. It wasn't the loud, explosive anger I had known from Micah. It was a cold, calculating fury that was infinitely more terrifying. He met us at the door, his eyes scanning me for any injury before settling on my pale, shocked face. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at me, and the temperature in the room plummeted. They touched you, he said, each word a block of ice. They pointed a gun at you. I tried to take you. He turned away from me, moving with a restless, predatory energy. He was making decisions, his mind working with terrifying speed. From now on, you do not leave this penthouse without a full security detail. Not to the lobby, not anywhere. He pulled out his phone, his thumb already dialing. The Moretti family wanted a war. They're about to get it. He was accelerating plans, unleashing strategies that had been months in the making.